some pretty heavy-duty filmmaking that's happened this year. Just a coincidence that we got those trailers in the same order that I sat people. I want to start by asking about this this act of observational filmmaking, and I'd like to ask each of you, what was the documentary that you saw early that captured your interest in this style of filmmaking? Laura, you've made several films going back to My Country, the film you shot during the Iraq War, and The Oath, and of course Citizen4, that are deeply involved in this style of being an observer. What got you started on that?
Yeah, first I just want to say thanks for having me here and with these filmmakers. I love these films and I love the kind of access and what this type of cinema can do in terms of helping us understand the world that we live in. For me, I was attending classes at art school and I was shown Titty Cut Follies by Frederick Weissman. It was, how many people know the film Titty Cut Follies? Yeah, so there's a lot of filmmakers in the room. So for those who don't know, it's a very well-known documentary that was filmed inside Institution for the Criminally Insane, and it was filmed all observational. It was Weissman's first film, and it was banned from being screened publicly for I think 30 years. The state of Massachusetts claimed that they were doing it to protect the privacy of the inmates who were shown in the film, but the real reason I think there's a consensus around was because it showed such deplorable and inhumane treatment of inmates. And so it's all observational, and it has some of the most extraordinary moments in it, particularly extraordinary cinematography. John Marshall, who is a renowned cinematographer in ethnographic tradition. Do you guys remember? I mean, there's this one scene, it's like 4-minute shot where he's following somebody and it's just sort of going through the entire institution and ends up in a cell. So I think it was Frederick Weissman's work that first turned me on to this type of filmmaking.
I should say, on my podcast, Pure Nonfiction, I did an interview with Frederick Weissman about his new film, Ex Libris. He also talks about Titty Cut Follies. You can hear that on Pure Nonfiction. Matthew Hamachek, editor of City of Ghosts. You've cut a lot of observational films. Maybe you can just tick off a couple of the other ones that you've worked on.
Sure. So I worked with Marshall Curry when I first moved to New York, and I worked with him on Street Fight, and then Racing Dreams, and If a Tree Falls, and then worked with Julie on help me out. Gideon's Army, yes, and then right after that, basically met Matt Heineman, and we worked on Cartel Land after that. I think though the movie that I remember was I was like I think 13 or 14 years old, and my dad said there's this movie called Hoop Dreams, and it's playing in the movie theater, and we have to go see it. I think Roger Ebert had just written this incredible review, and I still remember going in and sort of always thinking of documentary as being sort of like almost like watching 60 Minutes, that there was going to be experts and somebody was going to be asking them a question, and then I just remember sitting down and seeing this almost narrative story unfolding in front of me, and it just changed everything about I didn't even realize that I was watching a documentary when I was watching it. So it changed everything for me. And then I still remember watching The Oath for the first time and just thinking that I've never seen anything like this before. And also, one of the scenes that I still remember to this day is, and I reference this all the time when we're in the edit room, was when I think the lead character in it said, I don't want you to show this in the film. And then clearly we had already seen the thing that he asked you not to show. And I always sort of reference it as an example of how you are able to convey to the audience that you're watching the director's film, not the person who's in front of the camera. And it was just, moments like this sort of informed everything about sort of observational filmmaking for me.
Julie, maybe you can also remind us some of the other strong observational films you've worked on as a producer over the years.
Yeah, I mean, last year we had Life Animated and Wiener, Sergio, was kind of observational, not really observational, but it was with Greg. Yeah, I mean, What else was observational? I feel like those were
Well, those are
those
some
two are
good
pretty,
ones.
pretty strong
We,
ones.
Wiener alone, we can just stop on as, as a case study
Yeah.
in observational cinema.
But I mean, a really long time ago, I worked for what was then, what's First Run Features, Icarus Films, were a merged company, and I did international and educational sales for them. And so I saw a ton of amazing documentaries for those 5 years. But when you said that, other than Hoop Dreams, which I was thinking, but really, my Brother's Keeper, like, changed my perception of documentaries. I was like in Cincinnati for some reason, the only time, and we went to see it, and at this little art house, and I just remember there were 4 of us, and we walked out, and we were like, what was that? My God, that was a different kind of immersion. That was a different experience, and Jesus, you can do something really amazing with documentary, and it just shifted when we saw that film.
Greg, as Julie mentioned, your film Sergio, about Sergio de Mello, that's based on Samantha Power's biography of Sergio de Mello. That when I think of that film, I think of it as a very interview-driven film, because Sergio de Mello had passed away by the time you were making it. But you know, a lot of your films are kind of incorporating some observational, some interviews and other things, including The Final Year. What's the film that drew you into this kind of filmmaking?
Well, probably, I mean, the thing that got me interested in documentary filmmaking to begin with was Thin Blue Line, because it just kind of opened up this whole world of, like, you can make movies, which, having grown up in California, but I left when I was 18, but it still was in my head. It's like, maybe I should make movies. And then I just saw that. I thought, wow, I'm interested in the real world, and I can do this. So that was kind of, and then in terms of, like, you know, relating to The Final Year was The War Room, you know, because I'd lived in D.C., and there's just so much, you know, the way politics is covered is just so kind of like formulaic, really, you know, and campaign reporting and all, just, and then I just saw that film. It was like suddenly you could see the humanity behind it, and I mean, that was actually what sort of got me thinking about, you know, originally about what I might try to do in the film that became The Final Year.
So when it comes to observational filmmaking, the key to this is access, and you know how much you are able to observe the people that you want to put in your film. Each of your films poses different challenges. I'd love to hear you reflect on those challenges and how you overcame those challenges. After we talk about that, I want to talk about a different set of questions. Is that how you deal in a film with the areas that you can't get to, that you can't observe. So keep that in mind. We'll get to that part later. But right now, can you talk about, Laura, we'll start with you. Julian Assange, a notoriously controlling private character. How did you get into his world?
You know, it took a long time. I reached out to him a year before I actually started filming, so it was a lot of patience. I think this type of filmmaking is kind of patience-driven, and I'm really thankful for the sort of producers and funders that are willing to go along for the ride, because there's oftentimes a lot of uncertainty about what's gonna happen. So with Julian, I started filming in 2011, and if you were to look at the rushes, you would see that the first shoots were not the most candid, and then they became more candid as filming went on. And I mean, yeah, with Julian, you know, he's obviously very media savvy, but he also has a kind of an, you know, well, he's aware of the camera, but then he does things you would think that if someone who's aware of a camera wouldn't say on camera, which I think is a good thing from the filmmaking perspective. And what I'm interested in terms of like how you can understand sort of a person through observational. I mean, I think if you were to sit down and interview any of the subjects in our film, we would see something different than what we actually see in this observational mode. And so, for instance, in The Final Year, I mean, there's something about just even that I keep thinking about that film is like the body language. Like, what does it mean to like embody that kind of power? And how do you, even like physically, how do you stand? And that's something you would never see if you were doing an interview. You would get something else. You would get certain types of themes. And in terms of what you can't, I mean, I struggled with this film and also with The Oath.
Pause on what you
Okay.
can't, because I want to come at that as a whole different conversation. Matthew, can you talk about what you saw from the editor's room and in your conversations with Matthew Heineman, the director, what it meant for him to get the access to the group Raqas being slaughtered silently? These are people who, as we see in that trailer, are under a great deal of danger, and so have a great reason to be closed to having someone follow them.
Yeah, I think I'm sure everybody up here can relate that one of the challenges, you're given sort of this great opportunity when you're out trying to make an observational film, which is that you can go and you can follow people, but it's unlike when you're doing an interview-based film where you can basically go and shoot, let's say, 3 or 4 interviews, and you have the majority of your material, and then you go and get archival and you intercut them. This is something, the relationships that you have to build over time, it takes years in the case of our movie. You can sort of see from the trailer, but at one point in the film, the emotion of being hunted down by ISIS gets to one of our characters, and he has this sort of nervous breakdown. And getting to the point where people are comfortable with you filming them is really difficult. And one of the things that Matt Heineman does so well, almost unlike any director I've ever worked for, is he embeds himself with these people. He becomes great friends with a lot of his subjects, and it just there's a level of trust that builds up over time. I think our biggest challenge in the edit room, though, was that we had these guys who were running from ISIS as they were being hunted down, and in a lot of cases they were in apartments or they were in hotel rooms while they were being hunted down, and the fear in the room was palpable when they were filming it, but sometimes when it comes back, it's a challenge to kind of convey the reality of the situation, which is how dangerous this is and how much fear they have. And I'm sure you can relate with Citizen 4, and it's just sort of like somebody's in a hotel room and it doesn't look inherently dangerous, and that's a lot of what we face in the edit room, is sort of bringing that truth to life.
So I want to stay on that idea for a moment, that you talked about what Matthew Heineman does in establishing a relationship with his characters. Laura, I want to ask you about the relationships you would have with Julian Assange or Edward Snowden. In those films, the way we always describe these films is like the filmmaker is a fly on the wall, and that seems to be the the greatest display of observational cinema is when people are behaving as if a camera isn't in the room. And what advice do you have to other filmmakers about how to negotiate that relationship?
Yeah, I think probably we would never, none of us on this stage would use the fly on the wall description.
Ricky Leacock used to call it the fly in the ointment.
Yeah, okay, that makes a lot more sense. I mean, I think there are a number of, so there are sometimes, I think with both with Citizen 4 and with Risk, I was an actor in the events that unfolded, and so that I am in the film, and that was something I chose because I felt it was important to disclose that to the audience, and where I've made films that were purely observational because I didn't want the audience to be thinking about me. But I think in terms of advice, I mean, you should be filming in situations where there's something at stake, and that the highest thing at stake is not the fact that there's a camera in the room, that there's something that's more important or more,
Important than us.
yeah. And so if you film someone, for instance, emailing, you probably are going to get a really dull scene with somebody who's very self-conscious. But if you film someone who's trying to negotiate a deal, or who are worried about being captured by ISIS, then that is going to be what people are really focusing on. The camera never goes away, but you need to be in situations where there's something at stake and that's unfolding.
So, Julie, let me ask you about the access questions in ABACUS. Steve James, the filmmaker, is filming inside this family, the Sun family, who we see in the trailer, who are being prosecuted by Cyrus Vance Jr., newly re-elected district attorney. That's a situation where you might have a lot of pause to let a camera into the room during a trial.
That's for sure, yeah.
So, can you talk about how Steve, came to that topic and how he overcame whatever version there might be?
Sure. I mean, so Mark Mitten, who produced the film and who originated the film, who's sitting right here, Mark and Steve had worked together on Life Itself, and Mark knew Vera Sung and saw this story starting to unfold and went to Steve and said, this is a really incredible story. They met with the family, but it was really having that relationship with Vera, because this family is very guarded, and I don't see them having let somebody that they didn't have any connection into their world at all. And even with that, there was still a lot of layers. I mean, Jill Sung actually really never let us film in her home with her husband, with her kids, which, of course we really wanted, because there were very heavy stakes there. And she was the only one of the sisters that are involved in the bank that have that kind of a family situation, so you really do want to see that. She didn't really even want to be filmed, and what happened is I think the realization was, this isn't something where you can sit down and do interviews, because they don't have a comfort with this. It's really just showing up with the camera with the amount of trust that you're walking in there with, and starting that relationship right then. And Steve isn't the kind of filmmaker who goes and has a lot of meetings, and he kind of shows up with the camera fairly early. So they got comfortable with it, because it was filming their process of what they were doing to fight this battle. And so they were having these conversations, and they started to just get comfortable. And that's really a lot of what it is. If as Laura said, if they're dealing with something that's much higher stakes than having a camera, they have to have enough trust to just say, we're going to put this aside right now, and we're going to experience what we're experiencing and do what we're doing. But they were very, very nervous about having the cameras. That Mrs. Sung particularly did not want to be filmed, was not there that often, and finally she let us film her in Jill's house, but when Jill's family wasn't there, because we couldn't film Jill's family, it was like that kind of a thing. So she also, she has a great sense of humor. And
Mrs. Sun, by the way, steals the movie.
Yeah,
with
absolutely.
her comedy.
And nobody knew until that they started shooting. And Steve James also has an amazingly funny sense of humor, which people don't realize until they know him. But they really connected, I think, on the humor. And we went and filmed, there's that shot of her on the park bench, and one of her neighbors saw, and she told her later, we were filming a Christmas video, we hired a crew and we brought them in, So she was not having any of it, but she was scared, because she felt like this could bring shame to us. And also, what if they were, convicted? This would be their lowest moment.
Which kind of seems like it could be a likelihood with the power of the Manhattan District Attorney.
Absolutely, and they knew that well. Chantrell used to work for the Manhattan District Attorney. They knew what the stakes were, and it is kind of miraculous that they did. And they also knew that we were going to film this story, and we were going to try to get access to the prosecution, and we were, all of that was going to happen, and it wasn't just going to be, a family movie for Christmas.
Julie, I have a question about your role as a producer that I don't know the answer to. I know you as a producer. I see you a lot representing projects with distributors, or calling me up as a festival programmer and saying, I've got a film to bring you. And what I don't see, because I'm not around for that part of the process, is the way you work with filmmakers on the films. And I wonder if, whether it's ABACUS or any of the films that you've worked on, if you get involved with those subject relationships, or if you really let that be the director's zone, and then you show up later and the subjects are like, who are you?
Sure, yeah. It really depends on every film. In the case of ABACUS, we were the production, I mean, it was out of New York for a lot of it because Steve's based and Mark are both based in Chicago. So it was our team at our company Motto, and Sean Liness, who works for us, was on every shoot, arranging it, field producing, AP. Our DP, Tom Bergman, who also shot some for Final Year and shot Life Animated, he was, the DP. So sometimes we would even just kind of like say, okay, let's go. We have to grab this. We have to get this when Steve wasn't in town. So in that case, it was more like a real co-production with Cartemco and Motto. For instance, with Life Animated, I was very involved with every single member of that family, and still I'm very involved with every single member of that family. But that was something that was very, very hands-on, produced out of our office. When we work together with Greg and John Batsek, it's London, New York, LA. It's very different, and it's a different kind of a balance, but it's kind of an alchemy with each project for what is needed. With Wiener, it was shot when they came to us because they shot it over 4 days, and it was just like they kind of ran in there, got it, and then we're like, what do we do with this? So every
It was
project's
more
different.
than 4 days that film was.
40 days, I think.
Yeah, right, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that was like fly on the wall. That was the great line that Anthony Weiner said. I thought flies didn't speak.
Laura, can I ask you, when you hear the word fly in the wall, why does that term rankle you?
No, it doesn't. It's just not accurate. It's not. It doesn't. I don't have any problem with it, but it doesn't. It doesn't describe the situation because the camera doesn't disappear. It's in the room, but it's. But how it relates to the situation in the room is different with every film.
So Greg, last night at the premiere of the Final Year, you talked a little bit about having an entryway into that world through your previous connection to Samantha Power from doing the film Sergio, that she'd written the book about Sergio de Mello. And Ben Rhodes, one of the subjects in the film, about his reluctance to be filmed and how he kind of came around. What was your ability to navigate in that world? It sounded like it's dependent on all kinds of gatekeepers. And how did you work with those gatekeepers?
Yeah, I mean, it was actually, when you're saying fly on the wall, I'm not thinking of the devices that the intelligence community apparently has, like the cameras on a mechanical fly. That's what we actually want, one of those. Navigating it was, it was a challenge, I think. Actually, I went out to drinks last night with Samantha Powers. Like, a lot of her team came to the screening last night, and they all went out to like 3 in the morning, and they were telling me like how all the behind the scenes debates that they had about, because the bureaucracy was pretty much unilaterally opposed to the film, just because that's what they do. And just saying, oh yeah, right up until the end, we were keeping you out of these meetings and didn't want you in. And it was in a lot of cases, it was Samantha, who just like, there's one of her people said to me at one of the first times we were filming with her, just trying to figure out how to do this, because it was quite complicated, trying to just even the logistics. And before this hour-long meeting that we filmed, it was he had said to her, the one thing you cannot do is to give them your schedule. Don't give them your schedule. And so at the end of the meeting, the camera goes off, and we're just like, okay, what are we gonna do next? And we got to planning other things. And she's like, here's our schedule, and they're like flipping out. But we had those challenges. So basically, the way to kind of, it was just through a lot of conversations, a lot of frank conversations, because we were filming with USUN, the White House, and the State Department. Each institution had their own points of power, their own sort of internal politics that we had to navigate. I figured out fairly early on that it was Ben Rhodes, who was really you cannot underestimate how close he was to the president. Probably spent more time with the president per day than anybody, but probably Dennis McDonough, the chief of staff.
Do you know what kind of security vetting you guys were, like how big your team and who you could get in?
Well, it was interesting. I mean, you never know what's going on behind the scenes. So
You should try and put Laura on as a shooter. Let's see what
That
happens.
would have been great. I mean, yes.
Yeah, it would have been very. If you'd called me.
Yeah. What's that? We had, well, yeah, I mean, Erich Roland, our main DP, had done a lot of stuff in the Washington Institution, had been around, he'd done like Hillary's commercials and things like that. He was comfortable in that environment, but in terms of what the actual vetting was, I know they watched somebody in there watched all of my films, and they were clearly checking who was coming in and not. So, but in terms of what they were, you're gonna
I mean, did you have I imagine you had a locked crew. Like, you couldn't just switch out sound people, like if you're going to the White House.
Do you know, once we got somebody sort of cleared through, then no, we could actually switch somebody out like within 24 hours, and it was, it's odd, but
But they had to be clear. Like, once that was a cleared person, you could change, but you couldn't bring in someone who hadn't been cleared.
Yeah, that's right. But we had like a couple foreign nationals film, and it was just it was not as, in that regard, not as difficult as I had thought it was going to be going in. I don't know, but again, you don't know what's going on.
Greg, I want to ask you about one of the more tragic moments that occurs in the film, which is you're following Samantha Power on a trip to Cameroon, and the convoy of her cars hits and kills a young child there, and I want to understand how you were operating that day, what the sensitivity around covering that incident was, what you were thinking, as you were going through that day.
It was a horrible day. So I was in the car behind the car that hit the kid. So. It's very emotional. So it was, I was in the car. It was a very dangerous trip. She had flown up to northern Cameroon, and on the road that we had to travel from the nearest airport to the camp where all these refugees from Boko Haram were living. It's about an hour drive. There had been suicide bombers on that road, the previous week. And so the convoy, we had these armored vehicles. SEAL Team 6 literally was protecting us, and I mean, in the film you see these heavily camouflaged guys. They're all SEAL Team 6. So and the convoy was driving really fast, and I mean, so I remember the car in front sort of suddenly swerved, and I just looked out, and I was filming with a tiny little A7. I don't think I was rolling at that I wasn't at that moment, and I just looked and I saw something on the road, and then Rebecca Wexler, Samantha's chief aide, was there. She's like, "What was that?" She's like, "That's we just hit somebody, and they're dead." You could just tell. I didn't know it was a 7-year-old. I thought it was maybe a teenager. It was just a flash image, and then the convoy stopped, and everyone's freaking out, and then I started filming it, and it was. It was horrific, actually. It was actually, and so
getting
Samantha
out of cars at that point?
No, we did not get out. No. So the vehicle that hit that hit the child stopped. Some of her team got out, went to see how the child was, and the SEAL Team 6 commander ordered everybody back in, and said, "Keep going." And they called. There was an ambulance traveling with the convoy, but people were freaking out because they wanted to tend to the boy, and they said no. And I know that the commander has children himself, and was devastated, but decided. I mean, it was really controversial what they were doing, and the fact that they didn't stop. A lot of Samantha's team were very upset. It was a whole sort of drama that day, very difficult. So, and then in the context of all this, we're going to this Boko Haram camp, and it was just in itself incredibly, deeply, deeply tragic. And they didn't want that scene in the film. I mean,
But Samantha insisted on going back. You should talk about that.
Samantha then wanted, yes. So Samantha wanted to go see the family, and I remember talking to the regional security officer from the State Department who was there from the embassy, and I was like, "Oh, so to go back to the airport, we got to go through that village." And they're yes. So, you can imagine there's been suicide bombers in this. So it's obviously everybody felt for the family, but I just wanted to get home at that point and see my own kids, So it was, so she went back and she stopped and she went to see the family, which we weren't allowed to film. There's some stills in the You know, they were trying to like her press team didn't want anybody out of the vehicles, no coverage, nothing, and it's like they're just like reacting. People were actually traumatized, you know. So then, and then I interviewed her afterwards. She wouldn't talk to anybody, and I just like went into her cabin on the plane, but she did not want this scene in the film. You know, she's like, can't do it, and who's the reporter from the New York Times who was writing about it? I'm blanking now. From Sierra Leone, I can't remember her name. No, from Liberia. You know, like blanking.
Helene Cooper, or no?
Yes, yes, Helene Cooper. So she was there, and she wrote a couple of pieces about it, which were beautifully written, which the embassy did not like, and so I'm just like, of course we can't not have this scene in the film. You know, of course we're gonna have it in the film because it happened, and it's also real, and for me it just showed that I mean, sure, if the convoy was driving more slowly, you know, then it just, I mean, the boy was watching these helicopters that were circling the convoy and was standing by the side of the road and ran across the road to get a closer look at the helicopter and didn't realize how fast the vehicles were traveling, and that's when he was hit. So it was just, it was tragic. But it was, there's no way we're not going to have that in the film. And, she was, I think now when she watches it, she recognizes why we had to have it in there. But it was just like, we don't want to show the emotional scars of that. But clearly that's part of the whole thing. I mean, we're,
Well, what we're talking about now is it's a minute in the film, maybe less, but it exemplifies, I think, in all these films, just how deep the emotional layers go behind, many different scenes.
Yeah.
So I asked you about gaining access, and then I also set up before that I wanted to talk about how you work in your films for the things you can't have access to. How do you not allow that closed door to become a closed part of your film? So Laura, let me start with you with Julian Assange. How did you kind of work around structuring this film to convey things that maybe your camera couldn't see?
So I think with this type of filmmaking, we tend to stick close to our protagonist, and then the story unfolds sort of from their perspective. There can be multiple protagonists, but similar, I think, than when you think of a narrative, like a fiction, a scripted. There's a protagonist in that's the point of view that you're entering through. For Risk, and it was actually similar to The Oath. The most complicated thing was there's the bigger context, but like how to navigate contradictions towards him. Like that was, I think, like the verite material can do certain things, and it can do certain things incredibly, but there are certain things that it actually falls short on. And sometimes it can be like political context. It can be backstory, like where's somebody coming from? You're not gonna, you don't have footage of them growing up or something. So how do you get those kinds of things so that the audience can understand either the larger context or who you're documenting? And for me, it was, what was the challenge was also the challenge on The Oath, which were both protagonists who I think the audience felt ambivalent about. How do you make that ambivalence okay in the experience of watching it? And with The Oath, it was sort of bringing myself into my questions off camera, sort of breaking the fourth wall, was a way to sort of penetrate this sort of the questions I think that maybe the audience had about the protagonist. And then I think with Julian, I ended up using my production notes that I was writing at the time to sort of maybe answer some questions that the footage wouldn't answer, which is why is there a camera in the room? What is he thinking? Those kind of, what is it? So those kinds of things, like, because the footage itself, I think maybe didn't answer those questions.
So Matthew, in City of Ghosts, an obvious challenge to telling that story is that Matthew Heineman, the director, is following these members of Raqqa being slaughtered silently, who are outside of Syria. They're now living in exile in Europe. They get this material from a clandestine operation in Syria. What were the things that you felt in the edit room were posing challenges to how do we tell this story, and how did you solve those challenges?
Well, Matt desperately wanted to go to Raqqa, but was convinced by a number of people on the team that if he did, he would not survive one day there. And it posed an enormous problem for us at first because we needed to tell the first third of the film, which was these guys, which was the start of the revolution in Syria. ISIS basically filling a vacuum that was left by the revolution, with Assad being removed, and then ISIS deciding, and then our characters documenting for the first time. They were sort of the first people that ever started to document what ISIS was doing in Raqqa, and then ISIS's decision to then start hunting them down and their decision to flee. Luckily for us, these guys were very media savvy, or at least were learning how to be very media savvy, and had filmed tons of footage. So our challenge was, how do you, and we didn't want to sort of move away from the rest of the film, which was sort of very verite driven. I mean, it's entirely verite. And so we basically combed through hundreds and hundreds of hours of footage that these guys had brought out and sort of created a verite story that allowed the audience to not only understand the sort of political and historical context of what was going on, but then an important thing in verite that's always tricky is to establish character. And that's what we use that for, is to sort of say, is to establish who these people were, what they had gone through, so that in a way like the bow had sort of been pulled back, and once we land with them on the run in Turkey and in Europe, you understand everything that they're going through, and you can just watch these things unfold. And that I think was an enormous challenge for us, but really not letting it feel like a different film and sort of creating a verite story out of archival was an enormous challenge for us.
Julie, in ABACUS, a big challenge is you're filming making a documentary about a court case, and your cameras were blocked from going into the courtroom. How did Steve and the team work around that?
Yeah, I mean, we tried and continued to try to get access, and were denied at every attempt. So we realized at some point we have to do something that's going to be interesting. And
As I understand it, to get access to a courtroom, at least, and maybe it differs from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, you need the permission of the judge, prosecutor, and defense team in this New York
I
court.
mean, it's different. For instance, like when we did Gideon's Army, it was in Georgia, and it was the judge's decision only. But in this case, I mean, nobody wanted to be. I mean, even the defense lawyers, even the defense lawyers didn't want to be filmed. I mean, it was kind of odd. Usually, you would think they'd be excited about it, but
I bet now they wish they had been filmed.
yeah, I think they do. But it was, I thought, a really clever decision to think about like a courtroom artist and having that artwork really represent what was taking place in the courtroom. And Christine Cornell, who's a phenomenal artist and I think the most amazing courtroom artist in New York, certainly, was the person who we chose to do this, and who went and did sketches during the trial, basically, and then kind of created what was really needed, to kind of be that visual representation during the court discussion, during the discussion of what was taking place during the trial. And then, we were with the family in immediately after, they had come out of the courtroom, or, just in planning sessions. And so it started to feel like you were kind of there, because they were talking about prepping, then they were talking about what happened, and you had these drawings, and you had these conversations, and then ultimately Nick Verbitsky, who came on as a co-producer, we didn't think we were going to get Cy Vance. He got Polly Greenberg from the DA's office, who was willing to talk, and then finally Cy Vance, doggedly pursued, and that interview does not do anything, I think, positive for Cy Vance. I mean, since then it's become quite obvious that where his priorities lay with the Kushners and with the whole everything that's happened. Yet he was just reelected. But yeah, so that was, and then also we didn't have the voices for some of the courtroom. So we had the transcripts, And so the lawyers actually did read the transcripts of what they had said in the courtroom under the drawings, and then there were a couple that we didn't have, and we got Margaret Collin. Mark was so happy. We got Margaret Collin, who was on Veep, and she played the head news person who was, at the morning news show. We love Margaret Collin, and so she came and did it. And we also had, just different non-professionals who came in and read that. So we kind of created this palette through those voices and through the drawings.
Greg, I'm sure that every day when you're looking at Samantha Power's schedule, or whoever's schedule, you must have been conscious of the things that you weren't getting, the rooms you weren't getting into. How did you, construct a film to do your best to convey the things, or to make the most of what you could get versus what you couldn't get?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, Laura, you picked up on the body language. I mean, the way that they act, which is in the way they comport themselves, which is different than how they do now that they're out of power. There's just something about being in those positions, which is why I was, from the beginning, I'm not going to film anything after January 20th, no matter what happened before the election, because you act a certain way, one does, when you're in those jobs. And I'm sure if we had those jobs, we'd act differently too. It's really interesting, particularly as I'd known Samantha Power before, when she was just before even her first book came out. I'd known her. She was just a journalist, and she became something different, the same person but different in the way, and I think it's now she's more like the person she was back then. There's just something about those positions and the pace and the access to information that you have that nobody else has, which is something, it just changes people. It's very interesting to observe, so I'm glad some of that came across. I mean, it was kind of, partly when I was watching the film, it was all, my initial idea was that we just wanted it to be purely observational, So the two problems with that is that we actually have a lot of scenes, like just verite scenes, that didn't work in the end because they're so arcane. The level of kind of detail and shorthand that is used in a lot of these policy discussions is just like, it's so boring. I don't know how they do it. I mean, honestly, it's just, endless meetings about, it's just like, so a lot of that just actually was very hard to convey in a film without like a running crawl at the bottom describing what they're actually talking about. But then obviously on a deeper level, it's like, we're filming with the national security team. So it's like a lot of what they do is classified. They can choose where they want to let us go and where they don't want to let us go, So obviously we wanted to be in like the Oval Office when they're talking about things, or, in the Situation Room when they're talking about things. I mean, there's certain things I knew from the outset were, sort of highly unlikely, like being in the Situation Room in a classified discussion. They're not going to let us do that. Are they going to let us be in the Oval Office, which is a declassified space, the actual office itself, to have like, where they're actually talking about Syria policy? I mean, that was possible. And we were pushing for that all the time. And
I didn't know that the Oval Office, like any conversation takes place in the Oval Office is...
There's so many visitors, this is what my understanding, there's so many visitors in and out of there that they keep it, I'm sure when it's closed, they'll talk about things, but in terms of like what they consider to be it's considered not a secure space. There's a space just off there where it's more secure.
Now, I'd heard that over the years, the Obama administration had a house videographer, maybe for the whole 8 years.
Yeah, no, I know this. Library and all that. But they offered a lot of that to us. I mean, they didn't have great access either. They have some,
I hope those people were good shooters.
They were great, actually. I mean, they're really,
That would be a missed opportunity.
Yeah, but they had much less access than, say, Pete Souza, who's an amazing photographer. I mean, I have to say, just watch his books coming out now, which is watching that guy work, because he's just like this dude, and he has like this, the camera it's not like the most advanced camera, just like you would never, if you didn't know who he was, you would never know. He just has this knack of being in the right place at exactly the right moment. So he obviously, was in the real meetings, but he's not shooting video or sound. So that was a constant frustration there's a version of this film, when I look at it, I just see all the rooms we're not in. So I had to decide that, it can't be purely verite, and it can't be definitive. So it's not like we're saying we can be in every room, but I wanted to sort of capture enough, so you can get a sense of the emotional journey that these guys went through, and women, in the last year. And it was interesting, and even like with the Syria discussion, like, should they have been more active early on? I mean, I knew what was, the debates that were going on because I was around enough so I could hear things. Getting them to say anything on camera while they were in office was a challenge, and because you can't, sitting cabinet officials tend not to sort of criticize each other or the president, even sort of obliquely, and but we had to have it, or else you
Sounds to me like there's tremendous potential for the sequel called The Year After, where you sit down and interview these people about, what was really going on.
Yeah, well, that'll be in their books. I mean, they're all writing books. Samantha's writing a book, and Obama and Ben, and so all that comes. But that always happens. That's the thing that is what happens with every administration. Stuff comes out, and I actually didn't want to do that because once you get in that realm, then it's just then it's a retrospective. And so the way people talk and the way people act while they're in these jobs is unique and changes the moment they leave those jobs. And that's true of any administration. And there's something, what I just wanted to capture was the kind of the humanity for both good and bad that is at play inside these halls of power. And it should be uncomfortable. It should be, if you believe in Obama, it can be inspiring. But it's also it is something about the way our government works that as a filmmaker I've tried to get into. It's and you can really not like what these people are doing, and yet they are people, and they just end up in these positions with this enormous power, and they make these decisions for kind of human, complicated reasons, and it's kind of, for me, it's fascinating, and even when it's repulsive, it's fascinating to kind of see it at the kind of from the inside out, because I think if we understand that, it helps us all be better citizens, and we can actually level more accurate critiques if we kind of understand how these decisions are actually made.
I think also you knew you didn't want to do a sit-down interview with President Obama because he was so polished in those interviews.
So the problem is, yes, exactly. These guys, and at some point I had to put Samantha in a chair and Ben, but Obama, I never wanted to get in a sit-down interview. We could have done. They offered all that stuff. I don't want any of that. I want you want him.
Instead, you have polished stand-up interviews with Obama.
Well, yeah, but it was interesting. It's Samantha told me how to talk to him. It's which was invaluable because you don't go in and say, "Hi, I'm just this. I'm doing." He's been fully briefed. He doesn't respond to small talk or bullshit. And they have just so much stuff coming at them every day. I was trying to find a way of getting to asking about things he's not normally asked about, and is not part of the normal the day to day, and so the guy is incredibly articulate. Whatever you think of him, he just spouts off these incredibly well thought out sort of answers, but they were actually kind of just spontaneous, and so we worked really hard to find a place where he would, and the kind of the setting and the moments when we could get that, where it was kind of real and authentic, and because once these guys get in chairs and sit down, then suddenly they're just doing a 60 Minutes, which I was in there once, and with all respect to CNN, Fareed Zakaria was in with 20 people, with the crew setting up in the Roosevelt Room for a exit interview with President Obama. It's ridiculous. No one's going to be sort of, authentic in that environment. It's and why do that? You don't even need all those lights now with the technology we have. We didn't use a single light at all in this film. Why do that? It's just because they can. So I just wanted to just get real and just be there and just small little crew, small camera. Hey, we're going to talk to the president.
Now, in each of these films, any one scene that we're seeing that might last 2 minutes on screen probably represents, maybe a couple hours of shooting time. But so Laura, I get the impression that you'd spent long stretches of time with Julian Assange in Nottingham Hall, in City of Ghosts. Matthew Heineman, feels like he's hanging out in these hotel rooms a long time with these guys, often just watching them type on computers. In ABACUS, we see these lunches that are taking place in Chinatown as the family hashes out what's going on. And I'm sure those lunches were 90 minutes long, and Steve was going the whole time, etc. we've only got 10 minutes left, so we have to compress time here, but I'd love to hear from each of you to kind of pick a scene to describe, how you compressed time to get the essence out of that scene for the film. And Matthew, since you're the editor, let me start by asking you.
I think for us, the scene that always stands out for me is one of the last scenes in the movie, which I referenced earlier, which is this moment where Aziz, who's the spokesperson and one of the founders of this group, comes home, and he's just found a threat. ISIS has just threatened him in Germany, and he goes to the German police office, and they sort of inform him of the dangers against him, and they tell him that we want to give you protection, and he refuses it, and he says, how can I, in Europe, accept protection when members of our group are still in Raqqa, being under much greater threat every day? And this weaving of going to the police station and then coming home, and then there was about a 5-hour period after he comes home where he's sort of coming to grips with this. And I think we had a 30 or 40 minute short film there that could have easily, been just that. And it's like one of those things where you hear, you sort of have to be ruthless in how you start to whittle these things down, but still capture the essence of what the person is going through and the trauma that this is causing in his life. And it was really difficult. I think one of the things that we were hoping to do throughout the entire film is to make sure the audience realized that this really wasn't going to end, and this wasn't going to have a nice little button at the end. And I think that film really helped show that. And I think what was important is just to see how much this had truly affected Aziz, because I think he was very, very good throughout the entire film at almost making it seem like it wasn't it wasn't a trauma for him, and that scene was sort of the release of all of that. So.
Laura, is there a scene that you can talk about that, based on a lot of footage that describe for us how you shrunk it down?
Yeah, okay, I just want to say something, because I think when we talk about observational films, oftentimes when we watch them after the fact, they feel like, oh, they have 3-act structures, and they feel somewhat determined, but actually when you're in the middle of them, you feel total uncertainty. And there's actually also fear and uncertainty. And then you need certain types of frameworks, so a year is a great framework. You know something's going to happen. You don't know what it's going to be. And I think there's also a lot of observational filmmakers. There's a lot of times they're director shooters, Matthew being one, and I am also, I often do a lot of my own shooting. And so I sort of preface it by saying that the experience of the uncertainty that you're feeling when you're shooting something is what you ultimately, or what oftentimes you want to sort of condense the essence of in the scene, and how you go about doing the sort of cut down. So for me, I guess I would say there's a sequence, as I was filming, it became clear to me that Julian was up to something, and I didn't know what it was. And this is when he was seeking asylum, or going into, preparing to go to the embassy. But they didn't tell me that. They wouldn't tell me. They wouldn't say hey, Julian's gonna knock on the door of the Ecuadorian embassy in London. It's just why don't you go there? And so I would just go someplace. And so there was a scene where I thought I was meeting his mom for the first time, and I thought I was going to film a relatively boring scene in a hotel room where Julian hangs out with his mom, who I'd never met. I thought, okay, that might be interesting. And I walk in the room, and he's in the bathroom changing appearance, and I'm like, oh, what's happening here? And I don't know what's happening, and the mom is trying to kick me out of the room because she doesn't think it's a good idea that I'm in the room. And so then my job is to sort of go capture whatever kind of crazy drama is unfolding, and then in the edit try to have that come through in terms of the sort of weirdness or what I was experiencing and how to translate that. And I feel that that's with the election scene in the final year is kind of like that, where nobody kind of, you get that sense of drama unfolding where people really didn't see this happening. And so I think we're trying to those moments of drama, and how do we sort of crystallize them once we get into the editing room.
Julie, from your vantage point as a producer, is there a scene you admire in ABACUS?
Yeah, I love the scene. I mean, to me, the core and what works the most wonderfully with ABACUS is the family and the sisters. And there was one scene where they were just going at it at this, and it was a long shoot actually, because I remember sitting outside like waiting for it to be over for a long time. But it was, you know, just going back and forth, and Chanterelle, the youngest daughter, is trying to get a word in and trying to get a word in, and her sisters are just talking across her and over her and back and forth, and finally she just breaks down. And it's just this wonderful moment to me where they were like, actually had to be called and said, take responsibility for the fact that they were not letting her speak. This woman who worked for the DA's office, strong lawyer, incredible personality, yet
She's the
with
youngest
her
sister.
older sisters, it's just that dynamic that kicks in, and it's so relatable, you know, as to anyone with family dynamic just watching that. So I love that scene. And it's definitely condensed. It was long. There were a lot more tears.
Greg, I just have a minute left, but can you do some condensing and point to a scene?
Well, just briefly, election night, which had like, you know, the first version of that was like 20 minutes that was like suicidal. In the end, it's like 3 minutes or so. So, I mean, for me, there was that. There's another scene in the film where it's during the UN meetings, and the Syria peace deal is falling apart, and the Syrians bomb a humanitarian convoy, and there's back and forth between Ben and Samantha over a speech that Obama was giving, and they have an argument, and, you know, it's supposed to illustrate the limits and then the access, I think, is that there was a meeting with Ben and Obama and Samantha the night before the speech where they had a big argument about the state of the world and how should we view the world, and should the speech be optimistic or cautionary. And I knew that meeting was happening, and in fact, Ben Rhodes had offered us to have access to that meeting when I first pitched this project. It's like, every year before the UN speech, we get together. He's like, yeah, we're going to get you that meeting. And then up until, you know, literally as it was about to happen, we still thought we might get into that. I think in the end, Obama, knowing there was going to be an argument, didn't want it to happen. So it goes up to the president. But then Ben started telling us about it the next day. And then, you know, this big argument with Samantha, and she chimed in, so that it actually worked. But then right after that, there was this kind of impromptu kind of meeting with Ben and Josh Earnest, the press secretary, and the rest of the staff about how to respond to this kind of Russian sort of Syrian sort of bombing of this convoy. And they'd all been up all night, and it was just kind of, you know, we'd been around long enough, and they were just the nerves were so raw, and it's just one of those moments for me that, you know, they're just so frustrated that they are unable to do anything. To really find words that are actually appropriate to sort of describe what had just happened. And also, I think they were confronting to some extent that they'd been outplayed by the Russians, you know, which on a bigger level, clearly they all knew it was the whole election, the Russian interference in the election. They were going to bring that all out right after the election had Hillary won, you know, so that was all, that frustration was all like pent up. So there's some moments in there where I just felt like that scene was happening, I sort of couldn't quite believe that they were just having this very raw sort of discussion in front of us. But by then we'd been filming with them for nearly a year, and it just kind of happened. And you know, so it's just one of those moments you feel like, okay, we've kind of cracked it on some level because we're seeing it, you know, as it really is.
The final year is going to be out in theaters in January. Its screening is concluded at Doc NYC, but ABACUS, Small Enough to Jail, City of Ghosts, and Risk still have screenings ahead this week at Doc NYC.